They say reaching the summit is the point of the climb, but for me, standing on the observation deck of the Zenith Tower, my life's work, it was the moment I realized I had vanished years ago. Want to know why my brilliant protege went white as marble when he read the single sentence I left behind? Don't blink, because you won't believe what happened next. Achievement, the word itself, sounds like the roar of 1,000-person ovation, doesn't it? For 2 decades, I'd chased it like a phantom. I'd pictured this day as my coronation, the golden seal on a lifetime of revolutionary engineering. No more midnight oil, illuminating blueprints. No more endless soul-crushing meetings with city planners who thought aesthetics meant adding a fountain. And let's be brutally honest, no more pretending that the corporate gala canapes tasted anything better than compressed anxiety. I'd spent decades in this abstract glass and steel cathedral, watching the city's lights change through the triple-glazed, thermal-resistant windows, marking time by the slow, inevitable creep of the project timeline. I'd seen junior designers burn out and move on, watched rivals try to replicate my algorithms, and even survived 4 separate attempts by the board to sideline my vision. Through it all, I kept my head down, did the math, and refined every structural detail until it was, by any metric, flawless. I wasn't just a builder, I was a man who understood how the universe held things up, steady, reliable, the kind of person who always had a backup calculation and remembered the sheer stress tolerance of every single girder. So there I was on the podium, moments before the ceremonial ribbon cutting. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and contained ambition. My business partner, Elias, had thrown me a lavish reception complete with a video montage that flashed between my early sketches and the monumental reality now soaring behind us. There were firm handshakes, a few journalists angling for a dramatic quote, and a lot of promises about the legacy we were building. I smiled for the photos, accepted a crystal plaque engraved with my name, and tried not to think about how utterly hollow it all felt. My life, once cluttered with theoretical physics books and design revisions, was now bare, just a few final presentations left to deliver, and then this supposed freedom. As I walked to the edge of the deck for the final toast, I felt heavier than I had in years. The sun was setting, the sky a glorious blazing orange, and for a moment I let myself imagine all the possibilities ahead. Maybe I'd teach. Maybe I'd finally invent that non-polluting engine I'd always sketched on napkins. Maybe I'd just sleep without the constant low hum of future calculations running in the back of my mind. The world felt wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was terrified of what came next. I stood next to Elias, the city glittering at my feet like a scattered jewel box. He raised his glass, his voice booming with practiced enthusiasm. "To the architect," he declared, "who not only built the tallest, but the most profitable structure in the hemisphere. To the man whose mind is a machine. He is our foundation, the genius who has secured the firm's next 50 years of revenue." He was talking about me, but he wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the board members, at the bank representatives, at the glittering expanse of the city he now considered his personal vault. I set my glass down with a slight, almost imperceptible tremor. "Well, that's it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady against the roar of the crowd. "We're officially done?" He finally turned, his expression unreadable, calculating. For a split second, I thought I saw a flicker of something, a hint of the awe he used to have when we were young men sketching in a shared apartment. But then he let out a harsh, dry laugh that seemed to echo in the vast, engineered space. "Done?" he said, his tone sharp, his eyes glinting with cold disdain. "You're just going to sit around all day? You know, now that you've finished this, you might as well retire to a sandbox. You're only good for the complexity of your mind, old man. Without a new, impossible problem, you're just dead weight. This structure is the only soul you ever had." I froze. The words hung in the air, cold and metallic, like the unyielding steel of the tower itself. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe the celebratory champagne had loosened his tongue, but his face was an impassive mask of corporate indifference. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I couldn't remember the formula for gravity. Have you ever been told that your entire worth is reducible to a single quantifiable function? Let me tell you, it dismantles you in a way no structural failure ever could. I stood there, crystal plaque in hand, feeling like the concrete foundation had just dissolved beneath my feet. All those years of sacrificing sleep, skipping family events, pinching my social life so I could deliver a structure that would change the skyline. It all flashed before my eyes. I remembered the nights I stayed up worrying about lateral loads, the mornings I woke up early to rerun simulations, the ethical compromises I made so the project could be approved. I'd done it all for the idea, for the proof. And now, standing in the finished masterwork, I felt like a tourist in my own triumph. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the crushing realization. Maybe a technical counterargument, maybe a reminder of our shared idealistic youth, but the words wouldn't form. Instead, I just stood there, blinking back the sudden hot sting of tears, trying to make sense of what had just been delivered. Was this really the climax of my career? Was this what I'd traded everything for? Elias went back to shaking hands, his attention already on the next quarterly forecast. I watched him for a moment, searching for some sign of the earnest, wide-eyed collaborator I used to know, the one who used to argue for beauty over budget, who used to beg me to explain just one more complex equation before midnight. But he was gone, replaced by a ruthless executive, barely recognized. I walked slowly off the observation deck, each step heavier than the last. In the private elevator, I let the tears come. I felt foolish for expecting a moment of shared, pure artistic celebration, for thinking that this day would be about the elegance of the solution. I'd spent my whole life putting the project first, and now, at the end of it all, I was alone, defined only by the complexity I could generate. But as I wiped my eyes and looked at the cold steel of the elevator car, a new formula began to take root. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to finally put the architect first, not the engineer. Maybe this completion wasn't the end. It was the ignition. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to find out who I really was when I wasn't busy building everything for everyone else. But first, I had to figure out what to do about Elias and the legacy he was already distorting. Because one thing was certain, I wasn't going to let his balance sheet define the rest of my life. Not now, not ever. I'll be honest with you. After Elias's calculation of my worth, I spent a few days in a daze. I wandered around the empty, soundproofed penthouse suite the company had provided, making coffee I didn't drink, staring at the financial news ticker without really seeing the numbers. I kept replaying that moment in my head, wondering if I'd misheard him or if maybe I'd done something to deserve such a clinical dismissal. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was tired of being the functional core that everyone else took for granted, tired of being the company's theoretical safety net, tired of feeling like my only value was in my capacity to solve impossible technical problems. I'd spent my whole life making sure everyone else's empire was structurally sound. And where had it gotten me? Alone in a gilded cage with a partner who saw me as nothing more than a high-performance CPU. Now I could have drafted a scathing resignation letter. I could have begged for recognition. I could have tried to talk it out or maybe even exposed his ethical shortcuts in a good old-fashioned corporate leak. But the truth is, I was done. Done with the drama, done with the disappointment, done with waiting for someone else to appreciate the poetry of the structure, not just the profit. So I did what any self-respecting, slightly dramatic engineer would do when faced with a catastrophic failure of the soul. I decided to disappear, not in a tragic, call the media kind of way, but in a let's see how you like it when the foundation of your future revenue is suddenly untraceable kind of way. First, I got intensely practical, reverting to my nature. I sat down at the granite kitchen island with a cup of black coffee and a secure terminal, and I started making a list, a checklist for severing the umbilical cord, scrub every line of my non compete clause with a ghost protocol, check secure the intellectual property rights to my non Zenith related side projects, check it, call the lawyer, and quietly transfer all my personal liquid assets into untraceable non corporate linked trusts. Check, I even called the IT department and had all the account passwords changed to complex esoteric references from my favorite forgotten philosophical texts. Let Elias deal with deciphering the forgotten language of my youthful idealism for once. It was oddly satisfying, like performing a clean, surgical cut on a corrupted system. Every time I crossed something off the list, I felt a little lighter, a little more in control, like a closed loop system finally opening up to the atmosphere. Next came the hardest part, packing up my life. I didn't take much, just a single backpack of clothes, my oldest, worn out geometry texts, and a few faded sketches that still reminded me of the pure joy of creation. I left behind the rest, including the fancy suits Elias insisted I wear, and the expensive ergonomic desk chair that symbolized my decades of confinement. I figured if he wanted the intellectual space so badly, he could have it, the silence and the sterility of it all. But before I left, I knew I had to say something. Not a long, dramatic manifesto, just a note, something that would make him stop and think, maybe even feel a little of the crushing realization he'd delivered to me. I sat at my old battered drafting table, the one I'd used to sketch my first impossible ideas all those years ago, and I wrote, "Elias, I gave you every flawless calculation I had, but I forgot to give you the chance to value something that can't be quantified. Now it's your turn. Find the true foundation. The architect." I folded the note and left it on the empty pedestal where the crystal plaque once sat, right where he'd see it when he came looking for the next problem to solve. And before you ask, no, it wasn't just the complicated thermodynamic formula for the tower's efficiency, though I did consider leaving that just to keep him professionally guessing. Walking out of that sterile apartment for the last time was surreal. I half expected the building's internal monitoring system to flash red and Elias to come running down the hallway, demanding to know where the proprietary code was. But the hallway was quiet. Just the low, steady hum of the building's perfectly engineered HVAC system and the distant, muffled sound of the city outside. I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath. For the first time in years, I felt structurally unsound, and in that feeling, I found freedom. I didn't have a grand 20-year plan. I just knew I needed to get away to clear my computational cache and figure out what meaning I wanted from the rest of my life. I checked into a little slightly run-down workshop rental on the edge of the industrial district, the kind with perpetually dusty windows and a rickety, non-ergonomic wooden chair. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I spent the first night eating a cheap, non-gourmet sandwich and watching a documentary about ancient, flawed, but beautiful wooden architecture, feeling equal parts terrified and exhilarated. I kept waiting for the secure line to ring, for Elias to call and demand to know the location of the backup servers. But the phone stayed silent. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a walk. The air was cool, the sky a dull, ordinary gray, and I felt like I was seeing the world without a CAD filter for the first time in years. I stopped at a small independent hardware store for a coffee and a bag of nails, and the owner called me boss and poured me endless cups of strong, bitter brew. I chatted with a couple of contractors at the counter, laughing at their stories of structural surprises and sharing a few practical insights of my own that had nothing to do with megatall towers. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a craftsman, not just a contractor. As the days passed, I started to settle into my new unengineered routine. I read books, took long, aimless walks, and even tried my hand at carving simple, functional wooden spoons. I called an old university acquaintance, a former ethical philosophy student, who now ran a nonprofit building sustainable schools, and we met for lunch, reminiscing about the days when we believed architecture could change the world and making plans for a small, simple project in a developing country. I started to remember who I was before I became the architect and the revenue stream. I was still scared, of course, scared of being alone, scared of what the future might hold without the safety of immense complexity. But I was also excited to see what I could do, who I could become, now that I was finally living for the intrinsic value of the work itself. But every now and then, I'd think about Elias. I wondered what he was doing, how he was coping without me there to provide the impossible solutions. I wondered if he missed me or just my theoretical bandwidth. I wondered if he'd read my note and if it had momentarily frozen his blood. I hoped in some small way that my disappearing act would be the existential crisis he needed, because sometimes the only way to make someone realize the human cost of a perfect machine is to remove the human and let them deal with the perfect but inert result. And as I sipped my coffee in that little unpolished workshop, I realized something important. I wasn't running away from the Zenith Tower. I was finally running towards something that felt like a true foundation, myself. I'll admit the first month was disorienting. I was 50-something, alone, and suddenly free in a way I hadn't been since I was an undergraduate, struggling over my first truss design. There's a strange kind of silence that comes with being on your own after so many years of a team's frantic energy. No one calling your name, no one asking for a stress test analysis, no one needing a new parameter or a bailout from a design flaw. At first, that silence felt like a punishment, a cold echo of the thousands of lives I was no longer structurally holding up. But as the days passed, I started to realize it was actually a gift, a blank piece of vellum just waiting for me to pick up the graphite pencil without a profit margin dictating the shape. Of course, I had no idea what to draw. I'd spent so long building for other people's specifications that I'd forgotten what my own internal aesthetic even looked like. So I started small, reverting to the fundamental. I took long walks through the old, forgotten parts of the city, letting my feet wander wherever the pavement was broken and the buildings showed their age. I found a crumbling, abandoned historical society building with a massive renovation requirement, and on a whim decided to offer my services for free. The first time I correctly identified and repaired a long-forgotten, beautiful structural error in the foundation, I stood there with the dust in my hair and a hammer in my hand and laughed out loud. I felt skilled. I felt useful. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could do this without a billion-dollar budget. Next, I joined a local artisan collective that focused on furniture restoration and custom-designed functional art. I hadn't created anything with my hands, anything that didn't require a digital simulation, in decades. But sitting in that circle of genuine craftspeople, talking about wood grain and joinery and the intention of the object, I felt a spark of pure, unadulterated creation I hadn't felt in ages. We laughed, we argued over the best type of sealant, we shared secrets over hot glue and sawdust. I made friends, real friends, not just people I knew, because our company was jointly funded by the same investment bank. For the first time in decades, I was building for me, for the inherent beauty of the structure. And then because I figured I had nothing left to lose in the realm of human complexity, I tried volunteering at a local community college, offering an unscheduled lecture series on the flawed beauty of pre-modern design. Now, let me tell you, that was an adventure. I showed up with my old chalk and blackboard. Turns out there are a lot of young minds out there hungry for someone who has lived a little, who is built beyond theory, and has a few self-inflicted ethical scars to prove it. I talked about failures, some small, some hilariously huge. One student tried to impress me with a fully automated self-assembling dome that nearly disassembled itself in the demonstration. Another asked a profound question about whether a structure could be considered honest if its purpose was purely financial. But I didn't mind. For the first time, I was teaching for the love of the transmission of knowledge, not for a future consulting fee. I was learning to enjoy the moment, to say yes to unscripted questions, to let myself be surprised by the sheer messy unpredictability of human inquiry. Meanwhile, back at the firm, Elias was left to face the world without my core competency. I heard about it through the grapevine. Mutual engineers, nervous subcontractors, even the elevator maintenance man, who always had a soft spot for my early structural models. He called, he emailed, he even sent a heavily encrypted message, probably hoping I'd left him the master equation in a data packet. At first, I ignored his messages. I needed space, and I wanted him to feel the structural weight of his own choices. But as the weeks went by, his tone changed. The angry, demanding voicemails turned into slightly desperate appeals for a single, small piece of advice. The emails went from, "Where is the IP?" to, "I actually missed the intellectual sparring." He even showed up at the community college asking if anyone had seen the genius with the chalk. They hadn't, but they told him the former genius was teaching about the intrinsic beauty of a perfectly executed dovetail joint. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt to see him struggle. I'm a mentor, after all. It's in my DNA to want to solve the problem, to swoop in and provide the most elegant solution. But I knew deep down that this was an ethical and professional reckoning he needed to go through. He'd spent his whole career leaning on my computational power, expecting me to catch him every time his ambition exceeded his moral foundation. Now he had to learn to build his own ethical framework. It wasn't easy for either of us, but sometimes the hardest structural tests are the ones that matter most. As for me, I kept exploring the fundamentals. I took a stonemasonry class at the Technical Institute and discovered I had a knack for creating something that felt timeless and genuinely load-bearing. I volunteered at the local homeless shelter, helping them design and build simple, efficient, dignified micro homes, and found a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my first university lecture. I even started writing in a journal, jotting down my thoughts, my new ideas, and the ethical anxieties of the modern world. It was messy, it was honest, and it was all mine, free of non-disclosure agreements. One afternoon, I sat in my small, dusty workshop, sipping coffee and watching the light fall on the grain of the wood I was carving. I realized I hadn't felt this complete in a long, long time. I wasn't rich, I wasn't famous, and I certainly wasn't anyone's idea of a cutting-edge technological success story, but I was happy. I was free. I was living life on my own terms, dictated only by the resistance of the material and the integrity of the design. Of course, there were moments of doubt. There were nights when the loneliness of the unstructured life crept in, when I missed the sound of a supercomputer whirring or the comfort of an infinitely complex problem. There were days when I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake, if I'd thrown away a legacy for a shot at something that might never be recognized beyond a small circle of craftsmen. But then I'd remember the cold, clinical look in Elias's eyes that day, the sting of his words, and I'd remind myself why I left. I deserved more than to be a component in someone else's quarterly report. I deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be appreciated for the soul in the blueprint, not just the financial return on investment. So I kept going. I kept designing. I kept building. And as the weeks turned into months, I realized that technical fear and artistic excitement are really just two sides of the same design constraint. Every new material, every new connection, every new day was a chance to start over, to become the designer I'd always wanted to be. And somewhere along the way, I found myself, not the cold, calculating mind, not the revenue-generating architect, not the dead weight my partner once called me, but the craftsman I was always meant to be: independent, resilient, unapologetically flawed, and functional. Time has a funny way of wearing down even the sharpest industrial edges. Weeks turned into months, and the world kept spinning without my calculations to prop it up. Even as I built a new, quieter life for myself, I found a beautiful rhythm in my days. Morning talks with the hardware store owner, afternoons spent teaching at the institute, evenings spent carving wood or sharing practical insights with new friends. I was learning to enjoy my own company, to savor the quiet moments of creation, to trust that I could handle whatever came next without needing to simulate the outcome. But even as I grew stronger, there was a part of me that ached for structural closure, for some kind of ethical peace with Elias. I missed him, plain and simple. And I'm not the version of him that had hurt me, but the collaborator I'd respected. The one who used to argue for the inclusion of a beautiful but non-essential element, who used to laugh at my dry technical jokes, who used to believe we could solve anything with a few hours and a whiteboard. It was a clear, cool Tuesday when I finally agreed to meet him. He'd been reaching out for weeks: calls, texts, even a very formal, carefully worded letter delivered to the community college, written in the looping, precise hand he reserved for project proposals. Each message was less about business than the last, less angry, more honest, bordering on philosophical. He didn't ask for the IP. He didn't ask for a new contract. He just asked for the architect. So I said yes. We chose a small, unassuming coffee shop halfway between his high-rise office and my dusty workshop, a quiet spot with wobbly wooden tables and the scent of bitter espresso in the air. I arrived early, my nerves thrumming with a mixture of apprehension and hope, and ordered a simple black coffee. I watched the door, half hoping he'd show up in his old comfortable clothes, half afraid he'd arrive in a corporate suit flanked by lawyers. When he finally walked in, I was startled. He looked tired, maybe wiser, definitely more human. There was a heaviness in his shoulders, but also a kind of determined humility I hadn't seen before. He spotted me and hesitated, then crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps. For a moment, we just stood there, unsure of how to begin, two men whose professional foundations had been utterly shaken. Then he reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a crumpled, folded piece of paper. My note, the one I'd left on the pedestal all those months ago. It was slightly coffee-stained, the edges worn soft from being unfolded and refolded. He slid it across the table to me, his hands trembling just a little. "I've had this analyzed by 3 separate behavioral psychologists," he said, his voice barely above the low rumble of the coffee machine. I didn't understand it at first. I was so angry. I thought you were deliberately sabotaging the IPO, but now I get it. I really do. The company nearly collapsed, not structurally, but ethically. I looked down at the note, remembering the night I wrote it. I'd been so sure, so resolute, but also so fundamentally scared of being misunderstood. I wanted him to know I valued our shared history, but I also needed him to understand that partnership wasn't the same as intellectual servitude, that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is to let them crash and feel the full, terrifying weight of their own management decisions. I read the words again as if seeing them for the first time. Elias, I gave you every flawless calculation I had, but I forgot to give you the chance to value something that can't be quantified. Now it's your turn. Find the true foundation, the architect. We sat down, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The hiss of the espresso machine filled the quiet space, a gentle, steady white noise. Finally, Elias broke the silence. He told me about the months since I'd left, how hard it had been, how many mistakes he'd made, how many times he'd wanted to pick up the phone and beg me to just solve one last, crippling problem, but he didn't. He learned to hire based on integrity, not just credentials, to budget for social impact, to handle the little messy human disasters that used to send him running to me for a clean technical solution. He found a new sense of purpose in making the company better, not just bigger, made friends with people who cared about community, not just capital. He even started a pro bono initiative at the firm, helping small independent inventors get their ethical ideas to market, walking them through the initial patent stages, just like I was now teaching the students. I was so certain your value was just in the complexity of your mind, he admitted, his eyes shining with uncharacteristic tears. But now I see you were right. I needed to learn how to stand on my own ethical 2 feet. I needed to know I could survive without your intellect holding up my empire. And I did. I really did, but it was hollow. I reached across the table and took his hand. It felt unfamiliar, but strong. We sat like that for a while, just holding on, letting the debris of our past arguments settle between us. I told him about my own journey, about the fear and the freedom, the new friends and the old dreams I'd rediscovered. I told him about the stone masonry, the carving, the walking, even the hilarious, flawed attempts at human connection with my students. He laughed, a genuine, unforced laugh, and for a moment it was like we'd turned back the clock to our days as idealistic students. We hugged right there in the middle of the cafe, a clumsy, shoulder-to-shoulder hug, and we both felt the weight lift. Not the bitter, angry weight of professional betrayal, but the kind that washes the past clean. For the first time, we saw each other not as a computational mind and a financier, not as a martyr and a burden, but as 2 men, both learning how to live and build with genuine intention. We talked for hours, sharing stories, making plans to collaborate on a new non-profit community arts center, promising to do better by each other and the world. We didn't pretend everything was perfect. We didn't sweep the hurt of the past under the rug, but we faced it together, honestly, bravely, with open minds. As we left the cafe, the cloud cover had broken, and a weak, ordinary but beautiful sun was shining. Elias slipped his arm through mine, just like he used to when we'd head out from a late-night study session. We walked down the street side by side, not as mentor and partner, but as equals, 2 men who had been structurally broken and rebuilt, who had learned the hard way that true creation sometimes means walking away from your biggest success to find your most honest failure. Looking back, I realized that Note changed everything, not just for Elias, but for me too. It was a reminder that genius isn't about holding on so tight to your perfect solution that you stifle human connection. It's about giving others the space to fail, to stumble, to find their own ethical baseline. It's about trusting that no matter how far apart your professional paths drift, you can always find your way back to the shared blueprint of human decency. And as we walked into the brightening day, I knew we were both ready for whatever came next, together, but also finally on our own, true North terms. So, what would you do if you could walk away from your magnum opus? Would you disappear, or would you fight to prove the value that can't be printed on a balance sheet? If this story made you laugh, cry, or just think twice about the cost of your own ambition, hit that subscribe button, because life doesn't end when the ribbon is cut. It just gets beautifully, structurally interesting. This journey, this quiet evolution, was never about running from the tower, but about running toward the blueprint I'd forgotten I carried. I left the world of pristine complexity for the reality of imperfect, messy, honest creation. And let me tell you, the latter is infinitely more load-bearing. The initial shock wave of my departure reverberated for months, not just in the executive suites, but through the whole ecosystem of the project. And in that vacuum, the truth of my note began to settle like concrete. Elias's initial scramble had been purely professional. Damage control, investor assurance, a desperate search for the keys to the kingdom. But as the external pressure mounted, he was forced to look inward to the ethical, structural failures he'd overlooked for profit. The reports that filtered back to me through my new, non-corporate network were fascinating. The team I'd left behind, the young, bright minds who had once accepted Elias's relentless demands, were now pushing back, quoting my philosophical stance, demanding that the firm invest in sustainable, lower profit designs. They weren't just executing code anymore. They were engaging in an ethical audit of the company's very foundation. It was the legacy I'd always intended, finally taking root outside of my direct control. The ultimate test of a mentor is not what the protege does when you are present, but what they do when you are gone. And what Elias and the team were doing was proving the inherent worth of my original non-monetary vision. I, in turn, dedicated myself completely to the world of tangible, functional art. My tiny workshop, once an echo chamber of my past self, became a crucible of new ideas. I stopped designing for scale and started designing for human interaction. A perfectly balanced wooden swing for a park, a communal table for the shelter built entirely from reclaimed wood, a library shelf that flowed organically into a window seat. Each piece was an equation solved in 3 dimensions, a formula for comfort and human connection. There was no grandeur, no multi-billion-dollar valuation, but there was an intrinsic satisfaction that dwarfed any corporate bonus. One day, a local art critic, a quiet woman with a profound understanding of material honesty, visited my impromptu gallery. She didn't know who I was or where I'd come from. She simply studied the lines of a simple, functional bench I had carved. "It's flawed," she noted, running a finger over a slightly asymmetrical joint. "But the flaw is intentional. It acknowledges the imperfection of the hand, and in doing so, it acquires a soul the perfectly mass-produced object can never possess. It is honest architecture." Her words hit me with the force of a revelation. All those years I had been chasing flawlessness, believing that perfect engineering was the highest form of truth. But truth, I now understood, was in the acknowledgement of the inevitable structural imperfection of life. It was a philosophical shift that allowed me to finally forgive myself for the ethical compromises I'd made on the Zenith Tower. The building was flawed, not structurally, but in its intent, and now I could accept that, not as a failure, but as a lesson etched in the skyline. This new understanding became the basis of my lectures, my carvings, and my new life. I taught my students not how to avoid error, but how to embrace it, how to design a system that could gracefully absorb inevitable shock. I taught them that the most revolutionary thing they could ever build was a career defined by integrity, not gross profit. And as I taught, I saw the fire in their eyes, the same fire that Elias and I had shared before the pressure of the market extinguished it. It was a beautiful cyclical process of giving what I had initially failed to give Elias, the permission to be human. Months after the cafe meeting, the collaborative spirit with Elias took a concrete form, but not a profitable one. We worked together in my dusty, imperfect workshop on the plans for the community center. He handled the logistics, the permits, the budget, the practical necessities he had finally learned to execute with a sense of purpose. I handled the design, the material selection, the ethos, the parts he had once outsourced. There was a respect between us now, a quiet, almost brotherly understanding that transcended our professional history. He never once asked about the algorithms of the Zenith Tower. He only asked about the why of the community center's design choices. It was during one of these late-night sessions that he pulled out a heavily annotated copy of my farewell note. He'd framed it not as a threat or a puzzle, but as a daily reminder. "You know," he confessed, sanding a rough edge on a piece of reclaimed wood, "I finally realized the structure you left wasn't the tower. It was the vacuum. You didn't just disappear, you left behind a perfectly engineered absence that forced us to fill it with something better than money. It was the single most brilliant piece of design you ever executed." We looked at each other and laughed, a shared, genuine sound that was absent of any bitterness. It was the sound of two men who had been through a professional war and come out as friends. The experience had taught me that letting go is not the act of abandoning responsibility, it is the ultimate act of trust. It is the architectural equivalent of trusting a perfectly executed arch to hold its own weight. I had trusted Elias, and by extension the world, to find their own structural integrity in my absence, and they had. The Zenith Tower still stands, a monument to my technical skill and my former ambition. But now, when I look at the skyline, I don't see the tower as the climax. I see it as the backdrop to the small, imperfect, yet deeply meaningful community center we eventually built, a foundation made of genuine collaboration and shared human purpose. That little center, with its wobbly wooden tables and its intentionally asymmetrical joints, that is my true legacy, the structure that finally possesses a soul. I learned that my true complexity wasn't in solving equations, but in solving the equation of a meaningful life. And that equation, let me assure you, has no definitive answer, only an infinite number of beautiful, unfolding variables. It requires constant re-engineering, constant ethical audits, and the courage to walk away from anything that calculates your worth with a purely financial metric. The journey from the pinnacle of engineering to the quiet humility of craftsmanship was the greatest project I will ever undertake, and it remains delightfully, structurally imperfect. And that, I realized, is the most profound freedom of all. It's the freedom to be an ongoing design, not a finished product. It's the freedom to start over, to fail beautifully, and to build something with your hands that you know will outlast your fame. This is the enduring strength of the architect who walked away from his masterpiece.